Imagine a vast, endless plain, the kind where the horizon feels too far to ever reach, where the wind is not just passing through, but living among the grasses. The sky is wide, the land is quiet, but somewhere in that silence, the hoofbeats begin. Tonight, we journey far back into the 13th century, into the life of a Mongol horseman, into a world of wind-burnt skin, dried meat, 12-hour rides, and a life where death came without warning. This is not a tale of glory. It is not a story of conquest told in bold, dramatic strokes. This is the quiet rhythm of daily existence within the Mongol horde, a life lived in motion, in discipline, in dust. In this long, slow narrative, we'll follow 4 gentle chapters. First, we'll feel what it was like to live as one of the countless riders, not a leader, not a legend, but just a man in the saddle. Then, we'll turn softly toward the shadow of a figure often spoken of, yet rarely understood, Genghis Khan, the boy herder who rose to shape the world. From there, we'll explore how the Mongol Empire moved like a living map, redrawing borders without rest. And finally, we'll sit among those who lived under Mongol rule, in cities like Bukhara or faraway China, where silence meant survival. Let your body relax. Let your thoughts drift like the clouds over the steppe. You do not need to follow, only to float. This is history told like wind through canvas. And the night continues to breathe beside you. You would have awakened before the light touched the plains, not because of a bell or a voice, but because the cold seeped through the ground, through your saddle blanket, into your bones. You may not have slept deeply. Mongol nights were not for dreaming. They were for listening, to the horses, to the wind, to anything that might signal danger. Your boots were still damp from yesterday, your hands cracked from the dry air. There was no luxury of comfort, no space for hesitation. You pulled on your coat, thick, smelling of sheep's wool and old sweat, and made sure your bowstring was dry. Everything had to be ready before the first hoof struck soil. There were no uniforms, no polished buttons, just furs, felt, and leather, each man equipped by his family, hardened by necessity. Your world was your horse, your weapon, and the man riding beside you. Discipline was not shouted, it was expected. Punishment, when needed, came quickly, and rarely had to happen twice. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was usually dried meat, chewy, cold, tough. Sometimes fermented milk, kumi, sour and sharp on the tongue. Sometimes nothing. You rode hungry, or you rode full. Either way, you rode. The saddle was both a throne and a prison. You might spend 12 hours a day in it, guiding your horse across frozen rivers, through endless grasslands, over jagged terrain. Your knees ached, your back burned, but still you rode. You learned to sleep while riding, to eat while riding, even to relieve yourself without stopping. Stillness was a luxury. Movement was survival. And above all, silence. No idle chatter. No stories around the fire. Orders came in gestures or few words. The horde moved like water, calm, relentless, unbroken. If you were lucky, your horse stayed healthy. If you were luckier, you had a spare. Each rider could have 3, 4, 5 horses, switching between them to preserve strength. The horses were short, stocky, loyal. They knew the rhythm better than you did. Did you laugh? Sometimes. When the night was quiet and the stars looked like they were leaning close to listen. Did you fear? Always. But fear had no place to live. You carried it tightly, like the bowstring you refused to let grow slack. You feared your commander. You feared failure. And sometimes you feared the silence itself, because silence could mean ambush. Or worse, it could mean you had been forgotten. You lived without home, without rest. The felt walls of your tent could vanish tomorrow. The man riding beside you today could fall in the next raid. Nothing was yours. Everything was borrowed, including time. And still, you rode. The life of a Mongol horseman was not about conquest. It was about endurance. It was about rhythm. It was about knowing that the steppe would not pity you, and neither would the wind. And somewhere far ahead, another village waited, another border, another dawn that did not care if you had slept. Segment 2. Genghis Khan, the boy who conquered the world before the empire, before the fear, before the word Khan meant anything beyond a whisper in the grass. There was simply a boy named Temujin. He was not born into glory. He was born into uncertainty. Around the year 1162, in the high steppes of what we now call Mongolia, Temujin came into a world shaped by cold winds, shifting alliances, and constant hunger. His father was a chieftain, yes, but in a world where chieftains were many, and loyalty was as thin as ice in spring. When Temujin was 9 years old, his father was poisoned by a rival tribe. No war, no dramatic clash, just a slow, quiet end over a shared meal. And in that one moment, the child and his family fell from grace to exile. Other clans abandoned them. Stripped of protection, they wandered, hunting for roots, eating whatever they could find. Temujin and his brothers learned not to weep, but to wait. Not to shout, but to survive. Imagine the cold, not just in the air, but in the stares of those who once offered fire and now offered nothing. Imagine your hands learning the feel of a bow before they had even learned how to write your own name. He grew not through education, but through observation. He watched how men bent before power or broke trying to resist it. Temujin's rise did not come with sudden victories. It came with patience, with learning the rhythm of alliances, the use of silence, the cost of trust. He married young, to Bert, a woman who would remain his anchor through war and wandering. When she was kidnapped by a rival tribe, Temujin did not despair. He formed an alliance. He planned, he struck, he brought her home. And perhaps in that small act, we already see the shape of the man he would become. Loyal, calculating, unyielding. As he grew, he began to gather followers, not by promising them riches, but by offering something almost foreign in the steppe: fairness. Temujin shared the spoils. He elevated men by merit, not bloodline. He listened more than he spoke. He rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal, not with rage, but with certainty. And so, the name Temujin began to grow heavier. It was no longer just a name. It was a presence. Eventually, he united the Mongol tribes, not through a single battle, but through dozens of small ones, skirmishes, negotiations, surprises in the night. In 1206, he was declared Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. The boy who once foraged for roots became the voice that sent horsemen to the edges of the known world. But Genghis was not a man who built palaces. He slept in tents, rode with his army, and treated war as both necessity and art. His conquests were brutal, yes, but his methods were often logical, even progressive. He tolerated religions, simplified laws, protected merchants, and demanded discipline. To his enemies, he was terror. To his men, he was the center of gravity. His empire stretched from China to Europe, but he remained a nomad. He preferred the stars to the ceiling. His rest was never permanent. Even his death, in 1227, is cloaked in silence. No one knows exactly how he died or where he was buried. His tomb, like his early years, remains hidden, perhaps by design, perhaps by wind. And so, Genghis Khan became not just a ruler, but a rhythm in history, a name that gallops across the centuries, stirring both awe and unease. He did not begin with greatness. He began with cold hands, empty bowls, and eyes that watched the wind. And slowly, steadily, he became the wind itself, invisible but everywhere. When you look at a map today, it feels fixed, as if the borders were carved into the earth itself. But in the time of the Mongols, the map was not still. It breathed, it bent, and under the hooves of horses, it moved. The Mongol Empire did not simply expand, it unfolded. Slowly at first, like a tent being raised on a silent plain. And then all at once, as if the horizon itself were being pulled outward. After uniting the Mongol tribes, Genghis Khan began to look beyond the steppe. But this wasn't the hunger of a tyrant. It was the logic of a strategist. He saw threats in neighboring kingdoms, opportunities in trade routes, and gaps in power that only the bold would dare to fill. The first great campaign was against the Western Xia dynasty in northern China. These were fortified cities, ancient and proud. But the Mongols, once dismissed as disorganized riders, showed a terrifying skill for siege warfare. They adapted. They learned. They surrounded, waited, and broke stone with silence and patience. From there, the wave moved east and south. The Jin dynasty was next. Then further west, into the Islamic Khwarezmian Empire. Here, the story becomes almost unreal. The Mongols asked only for trade. The Khwarezmian governor answered by killing Mongol envoys. Genghis did not scream. He responded with method. Town by town, city by city, the empire fell like dominoes, each struck not by chaos, but by a terrifying discipline. Imagine this from above, not as a map of war, but as a rhythm of movement. Armies traveling light, riding fast. Scouts riding days ahead. Camps forming and dissolving like breath in cold air. Messages sent by relay, crossing hundreds of miles in days. This was not just war. This was motion, perfected. The Mongol military system was built on clarity and coordination. But perhaps the most astonishing part of this expansion was not just its speed, but its flexibility. The Mongols did not impose their culture upon others. In China, they studied the bureaucratic systems. In Persia, they learned the value of irrigation and administration. In Eastern Europe, they adapted to forests and winter. They left no permanent capital because they carried their command in movement. They governed through networks, postal stations, roads, translattors, emissaries. Wherever they rode, they listened first, then spoke. And always, the map changed. By the time of Genghis Khan's death, the empire stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea. But the momentum did not die with him. His sons and grandsons carried it further, to Baghdad, to Hungary, to the gates of Vienna. It is hard to overstate what this meant. For a time, Eurasia was more connected than ever before. Goods, ideas, and people moved freely across thousands of miles. Paper money traveled from China to Persia. Astronomers shared theories between Samarkand and Beijing. Artisans moved from one end of the world to the other. But it all began with motion. With maps that could not hold still. With horsemen who knew how to read the wind. With the sound of hooves, like steady rain on the canvas of history. The Mongol Empire was not just a territory, it was a system. A network of speed and silence. A geography of intent. And when the wind blew across the steppe, it carried not just dust, but the shape of the world to come. When the thunder of hooves faded, when the flames dimmed and cities lay silent, life did not end. It adapted. The Mongol conquest, though swift and often brutal, was never purely about destruction. It was about order, an order that once imposed allowed life to resume its rhythm, though to a very different tune. Imagine a merchant in Bukhara, a city once captured by Genghis Khan himself. It had been burned, yes, its leaders punished. But as the dust settled, life cautiously crept back. Markets reopened. Bread was baked. Camels again padded into the city, their packs heavy with silks, ceramics, and spices. Under Mongol rule, trade routes flourished like never before. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, created a corridor of relative safety stretching from the Yellow Sea to the Mediterranean. Along these paths moved goods, ideas, diseases, stories, and dreams. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar became waypoints, not just for commerce, but for culture. Taxes were levied, but often fairly. Religious practices were, for the most part, tolerated. So long as tribute was paid and order maintained, the Mongols allowed a surprising degree of autonomy. Their laws were strict, but predictable. Theft was punished. Disobedience was not easily forgiven, but peace was encouraged. In China, the Mongol impact was even more transformative. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, established the Yuan dynasty and made himself emperor, not just Khan of the steppe, but son of heaven. The Mongols now ruled a civilization far older and more complex than their own, and so they adapted. The capital was moved to what would become Beijing. The city was reshaped, not as a tented camp, but as a vast, stone-bound center of power. Chinese administrators continued to serve. Confucian scholars still taught, but the language of the court changed. The hierarchy was rewritten, and for a time, a foreign dynasty governed the Middle Kingdom. Daily life for the Chinese under Mongol rule was a paradox. The old rhythms remained: rice planting, temple festivals, family gatherings. But behind it all loomed the knowledge that the masters were different now. Their customs, their garments, their tongues, foreign, strong, and unfamiliar. For the elites in Persia and China alike, it meant learning new ways. For some, it was a humiliation. For others, an opportunity. The Mongol court welcomed astrologers, doctors, poets, and craftsmen from every corner of the known world. A Venetian named Marco Polo came and stayed for years. He wrote of paper money, couriers, and gleaming palaces. Imagine walking the streets of Khanbalik, the Mongol capital. You would hear Persian, Chinese, Turkish, Mongolian. You'd see robes from Samarkand, scrolls from Korea, gold from Baghdad. It was a city of silk and stone, where a horseman might speak with a philosopher, and a butcher might share a meal with a Buddhist monk. And yet, despite the cosmopolitan air, a quiet tension remained. The Mongols, for all their adaptability, were still conquerors. Privileges were stratified. Ethnic Mongols held the top ranks. Chinese scholars, once central to imperial life, found themselves sidelined. Some rebelled in silence, through poetry, through subtle resistance, through remembrance. But even in this imbalance, something remarkable took place. Knowledge flowed. Calendars were corrected. Maps were drawn anew. The world had shifted, not just in who ruled it, but in how its pieces connected. As the Mongol Empire eventually fragmented, split by succession struggles and internal decay, the systems they built lingered. Trade routes endured. Institutions remained. Cultures that once stood apart had touched, and something of each had stayed in the other. In Bukhara, a Sufi poet wrote of unity. In China, astronomers calculated eclipses using Persian methods. In Venice, stories of the East inspired dreams of silk and spice. The Mongols had not only ruled, they had rearranged the world. And though the hooves fell silent, the echoes remained, in stone, in scroll, in sand, and in memory. And so, the tale of the Mongol horde fades into silence. From the biting winds of the steppe to the tiled palaces of China, from the quiet yurts to the bustling markets of Bukhara, their presence was like a tide, overwhelming, undeniable, and yet eventually receding. They were feared and they were admired. They destroyed and they connected. They were nomads and they ruled cities. In every contradiction, the Mongols left behind not only scorched earth, but seeds. Seeds of trade, of science, of strange kinships across cultures once distant and unknown to each other. Imagine for a moment the stillness after a camp has moved on, the fire pits cooled, the hoof prints slowly fading under wind-blown dust. That is the silence they left behind. A silence filled not with emptiness, but with change. And perhaps that is what remains now, not the thunder of their charge, but the soft resonance of their influence, in maps redrawn, in languages shared, in forgotten roots that once stitched continents together like thread through a vast woven cloth. The Mongols passed like a dream, vivid, turbulent, and gone before it could be fully understood. But their story, like so many in history, continues to breathe beneath the surface of time, quiet, layered, and always waiting to be remembered. Let this echo settle gently. Let the silence now deepen. And as the winds of the steppe grow distant, may your breath slow, and the night continue to unfold, soft and vast, all around you. Good night.